title of this talk is Spirituality in Action, the Soul of Humanity Awakening Through Crisis. And I thought this was very much aligned with envisioning an ideal world spirituality, resurrecting the soul of humanity. There is a spirit of humanity that is definitely arising through crisis. And I'm going to speak about my experiences in Africa, as well as with the Shift Network, and particularly the Summer of Peace. And in starting, I'm going to quote Velcro Ripper. Who's heard of Velcro Ripper? This is a man you want to be aware of. He's a Canadian documentary filmmaker, award winner, created 3 films, Sacred Fire, or Scared Sacred, Fierce Light, and Occupy Love. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Velcro this last year, and he said, situations in the world are getting better and better, worse and worse, faster and faster than in any point of human history. He also said there is a revolution of the heart, a revolution giving rise to love. And he said this, those 3 films were based on going into 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, Middle East, all these different crises, and he's been witnessing this revolution of the heart arising. And the crises, different crises today are awakening the human heart and soul. I like to think it's the embodiment of consciousness coming in and expressing through each of us. In the own tradition, Kriya Yoga tradition with Yogananda, Swami Sri Yukteswar would say, we entered a Dwapara Yuga about 1700. Dwapara being an age of electricity and atomic energy, and this would help explain the technological advances we're having and that they are outpacing our moral human development. And it creates conditions for great disparities of wealth as well as horrific war. So it makes sense that situations are getting better and better, worse and worse, faster and faster. And we can see this in our own lives. Think about the last 30 years, how the fax machine was developed just in the last 30, 35 years, personal computer, internet, cell phone, and then also satellite communications and massive communications. And through this technology, we're ramping up the human potential, and we're also creating problems that are far more complex than what our current mindset can deal with. And those problems are so colossal: climate change, global warming, the economic system, that's going to require a level of cooperation never seen in humanity before in order to address those. So we're being forced to move towards a level of cooperation. Old systems are falling apart. Old systems based on dominance, separation, greed, fear are starting to fall apart. They can't handle the new consciousness that's coming in. And this new consciousness is starting to emerge, new ways of being based on interconnectedness, interdependence, a sense of what I would also say divine qualities, divine feminine qualities of compassion and love. And it's really a time when the divine feminine is really rising to help balance out the masculine. Paul Hawkins would say there's a blessed unrest. Again, to me, this is not pie in the sky. This is grounded, practical, it's real. And what I'm going to do is tell some stories. And when I was preparing for this, Sheldon and Helena said, do go ahead and tell some of the stories I've told in the past, just to ground this into like the grist of realities. I'm not going to be speaking from theories, little astrology coming from me, so sorry about that, or metaphysics. I'm going to just be speaking about from my heart what I've seen and witnessed and experienced, and then bring light to that fact that there is an emerging wave that gives us hope. And again, I'm going to be particularly focusing on the divine feminine qualities of compassion, nurturing, and connectedness. And I will also focus specifically on the peace building, this wave of peace building from the inner to the international. Inner, personal peace, mind-body health, interpersonal, community, education, all the way up to international and planetary. So this is a wave that I've had the privilege since 1985 to be exposed to and to participate in. So just to start off, born Indiana, farm town, large family, 10 kids, only planned 1 out of 10. You may have heard this. I was the only one planned. Mom and dad Catholic, no sense of rhythm, and a lot of love in the family. And just a really blessed life. And then went off to the Peace Corps, Sierra Leone, West Africa. Who also heard me talk about this before? Peace Corps, Sierra Leone, West Africa. And that's when life really changed dramatically. Living in 2 small remote villages, Cagbury and Masongbo, both had about 300 people, and no electricity, no running water. People invited me into their homes, into their lives, and had a profound transformation. Normally, Peace Corps is 2 years, stayed 4 years. And in that transformation, I was exposed to what it's like to live on less than $1 a day. People who lived closely to the earth. Big sense of connectedness, family, community, relationship with nature. Cycles, rhythms ruled everything. Rainy season, dry season. Cycles of the crops. Hungry season when there was little and you had to work hard on the farms. And then harvest season when there was an abundance, which coincided with the times of celebration. Cycles of the moon. New moon, no electricity, very dark, couldn't see the hand in front of the face. Full moon, dry season, all this village electricity and celebration, and people staying up all night long. And then also there was the secret spiritual societies in the bush, going back hundreds of years, living side by side with Christianity and Muslim, but these old secret societies would initiate young boys and girls to become adults. And I would hear this chanting in the bush going on for weeks on end. And they would teach them about the relationship with the ancestors, which were very real, and also the spirits in the bush. And then also Sierra Leone, it wasn't all romantic because it was hardships. You know, 1 in every 4 or 5 people would die before the age of 5. And I remember many friends dying. I remember smelling the decomposing body of a dear friend after 3 days. They were waiting to bury him before the friends come. So this, and then meanwhile, while they're even deep in the bush, I would see remnants of the Western pursuit of happiness, Western lifestyle, because all the T-shirts and clothes that we give the Salvation Army and Goodwill, they can't be sold, so they get dumped into Sierra Leone. And so our lifestyle in the West was impacting. I remember going deep into the bush to a village. I hadn't seen a white person in decades. Everyone was hiding. When they came out, they're wearing T-shirts from the United States, including a man with a shirt that said "baby" on board. So I was like, this was just a bizarre reality. Here we have this deep, old, traditional African society, very peaceful, and this Western. So it's when I got back to the United States, I realized that's when my really spiritual slapping this lifetime came. It was just like, boom, you're going to wake up. Not that I claim to be awake at this point, but I mean, still working at it. But the Western pursuit of happiness made no sense whatsoever. My family, which I love, were very closely interconnected, but while I was gone, cable TV came, then there were dozens of channels, more and more time in front of the TV. Suddenly there was elevated violence on TV, which made no sense to me. Why are we shooting and killing people? I mean, this just made no sense. I mean, I went 4 years without media, just radio, shortwave radio occasionally. And then the time we would spend racing to pursue things that when we'd watch in the commercials, youth, sex, and those were the things that were valued. And you'd see the things you needed to buy on TV in order to have this lifestyle that we must have. And then to avoid fear and all this pain, we'd have to consume and consume and consume. And I'm sitting there like, what in the world is going on? Everyone seemed to be in such a hurry to consume and consume. I was like, but we're impacting people in Sierra Leone. We're impacting people across Africa. We're impacting the environment. We don't even see the moon at night. Wait, where's the sense of interconnectedness? Where's this sense of belonging and well-being? But we're consuming. I was just like, it seemed like a train that was just going to head off a cliff and nobody was even paying attention. And then I met a yogi, my first yogi, Michael Singer. Who's heard of Michael Singer? Author of The Untethered Soul. Okay, I met Mickey Singer down at the Temple Universe in Florida. I went into this temple and this ashram. There's all these pictures of all these beings. I recognized Christ. That was about the only one. And then Mickey was talking about these states of consciousness. So I went to meet Mickey and I started to argue with him. I was like, Mickey, how can you talk about these states of consciousness when people in Africa are living like this and that? And if you remember, he just looked at me and said, who asked you how it should be? And this is one of the 2 questions that Mickey asked me, and I'll mention the other one a little bit later, that I think is really key about spirituality in action. Who asked you how it should be? So I argued with him, and then he said, look, if Pluto's orbiting in a way that you don't like, what are you going to do about it? At which point he just lost me. I was pissed off. I was in way over my head. I left angry, and I was going to go change the world. So I went to the Navajo Reservation, got a personal vision, go to Washington, D.C., and during that time, the Persian Gulf War came. I was like, we're there for our lifestyle, oil, and I was just angry. And then Sierra Leone went into a war. and my family and loved ones in Sierra Leone started living through hell. And I knew that war was tied to our lifestyle. I could hear about the blood diamonds used to buy these weapons from the Ukraine and other Soviet countries that had fallen apart. So I was really pissed off. And I went in to go change the world in Washington, D.C., started meditating 2 hours a day, crashed and burned, went back to see Mickey, and I said, Mickey, I crashed and burned. I said, like, yeah, I know. It's like, no, Mickey, I really burned. Talking to Heidi about standing in the fire. He's like, yes, I know. He said, you thought you knew what was going on and you had to get blown out of there with dynamite. And I was like, what are you talking about? He said, get in the car. When I met Mickey, he had a software company with like 15 or 20 employees. He took me to a new building, this huge building. He says, there's now 1,000 employees in this company. We just built this huge office building, and I didn't do any of it. All I did was follow the energy. When Shakti said go right, I went right. When Shakti said go left, I went left. And this could all be gone tomorrow, and it wouldn't matter. And he also said, that energy, which is guiding all the galaxies in the world, could take you back into Africa in ways you never imagined. Well, two things happened. A few years later, FBI came in. Mickey was under investigation with other employees. He closed his laptop, went back across the street to ashram as if nothing happened. He wrote The Untethered Soul. He's since has been on Oprah. He followed the energy. He was proved innocent, did nothing wrong, but he just followed the energy. He's like, okay. Stood in the fire. He's like, I'm no longer the CEO of this big company. To me, that's like an incredible standard of being able to follow energy. I ended up working with Search for Common Ground, and 2 years later, ended up on an assessment mission back to Sierra Leone. So I'm thinking, how did Mickey know this? I go back to Sierra Leone, and imagine going back to your home 9 years after a war started. I didn't know what in the world I was going to meet. As soon as I got off the ferry boat from the airport, there was a person who recognized me. I went into the town, the city. There was all this military everywhere, bullet holes, buildings burned down. I'm like, this is unreal. This is my second home. Went up country on this road, same road where a BBC person had been killed that week in an ambush a little further out. We start passing these ambushes where cars were burnt out, and I'm like, this is unreal. We got up to this town, McKinney, where I used to buy beer and supplies as a Peace Corps volunteer, and this Catholic bishop said, oh, I'll take you back to your village on Sunday, Masangbo. It's not too far away. They'll be happy to see you. We're doing Catholic Mass. So we go back to Masangbo. It's this dream come true, and then I'm like, who's alive? And then I start seeing the Conte brothers coming out, and they're alive, and everyone's there but their sister Adama, and I was like this joyous dream. There was so much love, and anything they had, they gave me. Coconuts, mangoes, palm wine. They wanted to give me a chicken. It's like, no, I can't take the chicken with me. Thank you. And the poverty was off the scale, even worse than before. And then they started telling me stories about the women who'd been raped, the elders who'd been beaten, and the people who'd been killed, and the children taken to child soldiers. So I'm like, okay, we're going to be back. We'll be back. We're going to do a project here. I go back into McKinney, have lunch with the Catholics, and then when I'm leaving town, there's a mass mob killing. I didn't know what to do. I get out of the car, I go, and anyway, it's gruesome. And got these horrific pictures, the person had already been killed, and then we take off, and I was just like, what is going on? And I'm trying to meditate, and I was just like, I didn't know what to do. So I go back to Washington, D.C. We prepare a report to start this big project in Sierra Leone. Come into the office, front page of the New York Times is on my desk. Someone had put it there. On the front page is a woman from Sierra Leone from the same place where I had just been 2 weeks earlier with both arms cut off. My heart ripped completely open. I read where the Catholic bishop had been captured, the one who took me back to the village. It was in the area where my friends were living, and the rebels were taking things to a new level of terror. I lost it. I completely lost it. My meditation practice could not hold it. So I started praying for a mentor, and then I thought of Yogananda as saying, when all else fails, you turn to the Divine Mother. She's helpless. She has to respond to our cries. So I just threw myself, and I just intuitively started doing these practices of just praying to the Divine Mother, demanding that she show up and reveal herself. And in the book, I go into greater detail about this, about slowly it was this incredible ecstatic poetry started to come out, and then there was these experiences of ecstatic divine love. And at one point during these experiences, I found myself just, the waves just coming through and through and through, and then I just started sobbing, saying, I've missed you, I've missed you, I've missed you. And the response was, I am always with you. A couple years later, we got the funding to go into Sierra Leone. Meanwhile, the rebels came through and completely sacked Freetown, 3,000 people killed, put on CNN, United Nations response. They go in, and then suddenly I'm going back to Sierra Leone on these peace-building missions. I got back to the villages again and saw that they were sacked by rebel soldiers, including one unit headed by a teenage boy named Colonel Rambo, who was trained by watching Rambo movies. We think that violent films cause havoc and encourage shootings in the United States. There are thousands of little video parlors now across sub-Saharan Africa. For pennies, young children are watching these violent films, and they can't tell the difference between the violence and what's happening. So again, this Western pursuit of happiness is impacting people in the world that we never even dream of. I would say right now, all across Africa, there are young children watching violent Hollywood, Bollywood films. And so there was still this must do something, and luckily, so I got to see the impact, and luckily I was working with Search for Common Ground, which was doing tangible, hard-nosed, peace-building work. And I got to meet these incredible people who were doing inspiring work. And by traveling, not only Sierra Leone, Liberia, Congo, Nigeria, Rwanda, Burundi, Angola, Guinea, all these different countries, I started to see that there was a relationship between the mystical traditions of going inward and then the outward, tangible ways of transforming conflict across entire societies, which is what the work of Search for Common Ground and others were doing. I started to see these parallels. And some of the themes that came out is, first of all, is that conflict is absolutely a natural part of the human experience and an integral part of a spiritual path. And you can look at this on many levels. First of all, conflict is going to arise because of just differences, political or cultural, whatever. They can arise. But if you take it deeper, it arises right at that point of sense of separation from source. Tara Brach, a Buddhist meditation instructor, would say, a psychologist would say, as soon as there's that sense of separate from the whole, it gives rise to the wanting self. I want to be happy. I want to avoid suffering. And then we start to engage this world outside of us, which is constantly changing, to rearrange it, to get it just the way we need it to be happy and to avoid suffering. And if you throw into that a Western pursuit of happiness through consumerism, which is based upon outside of oneself, it's inevitable that we're going to escalate conflict to a level where we're having wars over natural resources, where there's wars over economies and everything else. So you can see it's natural. In the tradition, the Kriya Yoga, it even takes it a little bit deeper, where it's even ingrained in the very fabric. The potential of conflict is ingrained in the very fabric of the universe in terms of the gunas. Sattva, the positive aspect, moving back towards union in the positive expressions. Tamas, the negative, which moves more deeper into Maya. And then Rajas, the dynamic between the two. And that's the very fabric of the universe. So Maya must have this motion in order for there to be creation. And the Bhagavad Gita is just one big metaphor for overcoming that battle internally. So conflict is a natural part. And if it can be embraced as a natural part, then it can serve as a way of complete growth and transformation and taking individuals and entire societies to entirely new levels. There are some patterns I want to just touch upon briefly in terms of outward conflict. It's like the rainbow with the two pots of golds at the end. And the pots of golds at the end are the extreme positions, will drive the agenda with fear. And what happens is when there's fear, we start to narrow identities. We all have multiple identities. I'm an uncle, I'm a cousin, I'm a brother, I'm a gardener, a Kriya Yoga student, a director of peace, all these different identities. But when fear gets really intense, we have a tendency of narrowing it down to one. I'm a Hutu, you're a Tutsi. I'm a Muslim, you're a Jew. I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat. And then we confuse the problem with the other. The problems could be economic, environment, whatever. But when the other becomes a problem, we stereotype, demonize, dehumanize. And once we dehumanize, then we can go out and attack. The other thing that's happening is we are starting, the other aspect is that our thoughts are universally, not individually rooted. Dean Radin with the Institute of Noetic Science has proven that there's entangled minds. Our thoughts are permeating everywhere. We pick up other people's thoughts. You don't know whose are whose. If you ever sit in the witness in a meeting, you can hear thoughts of people expressing them, what they're saying. You take this on a conflict situation, it's not only a thoughts, but when we calibrate our thinking, whatever our predominant thoughts are, that's the frequency we're going to tune in on a universal level. So if you go into a deep practice and really pray with deep devotion to Divine Mother, you're going to tune in with the Divine Mother. Solar angel, whichever aspect, you can tune in. That same mechanism is working in conflict situations, and that's what allows child soldiers to be recalibrated to a place where they can go out and do death and destruction, because they're tuning in with an aspect that is very destructive, it's been around forever, and it also has its own entities that they will then flow through. Rwanda, Cambodia, Nazi Germany, we've seen this. But some of the principles of the peace building I saw was the way to overcome the negative is to increase the positive. Transformation is you introduce something new to the dynamic that didn't exist before. And then to awaken compassion and love, which Olivia was talking about, which is the innate goodness inside of humanity. And love is by far the most powerful force, as it's drawing everything in the universe back to itself. And so the search for common ground work, one of the key principles, we've seen this in a lot of the peace building, is to rehumanize the other. And granted, conflicts can get really complex, but when you're able to rehumanize the other, it awakens that sense of compassion and love. And one of the examples that I'll mention just briefly is in Burundi, which I've mentioned last year. Search for Common Ground started in Burundi a year after Rwanda genocide, and had Hutu and Tutsi journalists co-producing radio programs within a year of the genocide, including Agnes, who had lost 79 members of her family to ethnic violence. They modeled the behavior of a transformation that was possible. 90% of the countries listening to the programs. People's thoughts start to change. Instead of genocide as a possibility, coexistence as a possibility. It awakens humanity to start channeling in on a large scale that potential help that is coming from the different sources that's been talked about here. I was thrilled to join the SHIFT Network. The SHIFT Network is dedicated to a transformation, personal and planetary transformation. And it's highlighting different positive examples of that transformation and making it available across as many different platforms as we can. The Summer of Peace was an inspiration with the idea of telling the bigger story that's emerging. And for me, this was a dream come true because I've seen all these different peacemakers, and you don't hear a lot about these peacemakers in the news. You hear more about the negative and the destructive. And so by shining a light on the bigger story that's emerging, we can help inform, inspire, and involve people. And so we'll change the image here. The Summer of Peace. You heard me talk about what the Summer of Peace was going to be last year. Let me report back to you what the Summer of Peace was. And Dot Maver was a wonderful companion in this because she and I would always sit down, we'd get on the phone, and we'd say, okay, what's the bigger story? How can we serve it? How can we serve the bigger story that's bigger than any one organization? And there were a lot of organizations involved with the Summer of Peace. The Culture of Peace Initiative, Pathways of Peace, the Peace Alliance, National Peace Academy, the Gaia Field Project, many organizations. So one of the things that we did, and I was so psyched about this is the first time that I know that there's been a comprehensive mapping of peace building from the inner to the international and across 15 different sectors. We wanted to bring names and faces and voices of people to help people realize, yes, there is a wave arising around the world. So we had this telesummit, which is available for free. All of it's archived. You can go there, listen to them online. If you want to download, you pay a small upgrade, which supports, a social enterprise. And you can spread this as far and wide as you want. The idea is to inform, inspire, and involve. And so by the sectors that we covered was forgiveness, nonviolence. Each week, one was highlighted. Forgiveness, nonviolence, communication, education, science, justice, arts and culture, healing cultural wounds, business and economics, military, sports and Olympics, urban peace, politics and governance, youth and spirituality and peace. And what we were saying is we were quoting a man from Australia, Steve Killalea, who said, you know, Socrates, he quoted Socrates saying, you must have a language in order to understand something, to discuss it. And he said, we have one word for peace, whereas there's 14 words for beauty in Japanese, 99 names for God in Islam, 108 names of love in Sanskrit. So we wanted to show, look, peace is arising, and it looks different in many, many different contexts. One of my favorite, and my mom would say, never say she has a favorite son or child, but one of my favorite parts of the Summer of Peace was the Spirituality and Peace series. There's a wonderful man, David Nichol, who founded the Gaia Field Project. And David did his PhD on subtle activism at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Subtle activism being that the subtle work that's happening through meditation and prayer is actually is a form of activism that's impacting the world. And at the beginning of Summer of Peace, David just had this dream. And so we worked together, say, every Sunday we're going to interview someone from a different spiritual tradition and weave together this field. He said there's a comprehensive field of consciousness we're going to develop. By having these different spiritual traditions highlighted, we're going to be inviting them to bring in their lineages also. And so we very consciously talked about we were co-creating a field of consciousness of spiritual cooperation, bringing in the spiritual power of these different lineages. And he says, and when we have that field, then from that field things can emerge. We had no idea what was going to happen. But what did happen is by the end, a few weeks before the end of the Summer of Peace, he wanted to synchronize meditation events on the International Day of Peace. A few weeks before the September 21st, the International Day of Peace, David partnered with Patrick from MedMob and other organizations to say, let's create a synchronized global meditation. This thing, the field was created, this thing took off. In 2 weeks, they manifested. They just manifested all these organizations collaborating. It was the largest synchronized global meditation in history. It arose out of that field of collective consciousness with David and the Gaia Field Project leading that with Patrick MedMob, consciously working with the subtle realms, plugging in for guidance, listening, and then it took off. Always gets me. It's amazing to see this stuff manifesting. There's so many people around the world meditating today. It was said earlier, I think it was Keith said there's more people that want peace in the world than they do deadly conflict. Meditation has grown exponentially in the last few decades. It's seeping into Google and every place else. And it's creating a field of consciousness that's allowing us to tap in with the vertical, tap into whatever source you want to call it. And then when this synchronized events come together, it manifests. It's a visual way to see. It's a visual way for people to participate and to feel like we're each part of something much bigger than ourselves, and we can celebrate and have a sense of joy and deep peace. And this is just the beginning. This is just the beginning. Be the Peace is going to happen again this year. I encourage you to join David Nickel and the team from the Gaia Field and Patrick from MedMob and others. It's going to happen again. And this is really starting to bridge that spirituality in action. Meditation does impact the world. And where two or more and I are gathered, we know it. There he, she is. And so as more and more of us do this, and from many different traditions do this together, we can manifest heaven on earth. We can bring about, we can go through this next 12-year period. And we will. The other part of the summer piece, throughout the summer piece, let me come back to so you can see some of the people. We had people who were coming from a more secular place who also, this part that Olivia was talking about bringing out that basic innate goodness of compassion and love. There were people who you would never even imagine who were taking steps forward because they wanted to make a difference. Anybody ever heard of Pete Carroll? Head football coach of the Seattle Seahawks, National Football League. When he was at the USC, University of Southern California, he would drive, as a head coach there, he would drive through the neighborhoods and he'd listen to the radio to all the death and killings and murders happening from gang violence. Finally, he was fed up. He called a meeting with the mayor's office, the police department, the sheriffs, the juvenile, the nonprofits, the churches. He says, what are we going to do about this? The problem was more complex than any one group could handle. He was tapping into this need of collaboration to address complex problems. And he did something that many of the peace builders that I've heard over the last, since 85's talked about. They listened. They went to the neighborhoods, they listened to what was needed and what their experience was, and then they responded with a project called A Better LA, which has had documented impact of reducing gang violence in specific neighborhoods. He got collaboration and synergy. That's Pete Carroll. And when we interviewed him, he was as passionate about that as he was about the Seattle Seahawks going in, trying to make it to the playoffs. Another example is, this is one of my favorite, and this is a man you want to follow, Colonel Puck Mickleby, M-Y-K-E-L-B-Y, Colonel Puck Mickleby. We had a whole week where we interviewed people from the military, and the shifts of thinking that are emerging are profound. And then we went to Washington, D.C. We had an event at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and Puck Mickleby presented. Colonel from the Marines, Minnesota, and he did well not to drop the F-bomb while he was talking, but everything else is borderline, just boom, boom, boom. And he said when he was working in the Pentagon, he was tasked to work with someone from the Navy to create a grand national strategy for the United States. And so he got engaged. He got engaged, and they looked around and said, there's all of these strategies. Everyone's got a strategy, but there's no grand strategy. The United States doesn't have a grand strategy. He says everyone's got a strategy, and it's based on threat and response and containment. And he's like, that may have worked when there was the Cold War trying to contain communism, but the world's different. He said, our biggest threat today is climate change. He says we have a need to focus on sustainability. We have to focus in an open system, and we need credibility. We have to focus on education. This is a colonel from the Marine Corps saying these are our priorities for a grand national strategy. You can see this new consciousness writings. He recognized interdependence, interconnectedness. I heard this throughout the entire summer of peace. Interdependence, interconnectedness, compassion, love, cooperation. These divine feminine qualities are rising up even inside the Pentagon. Football coaches are talking about it. It's arising. It's happening. And he's left the military so he could try to get this out to a wider audience. Follow Colonel Puck Mickleby. And he's one of many other people. There's another basketball player, Meta World Peace. Anybody heard of him? LA Lakers. He had an anger issue and kind of destroyed the Indiana Pacers, which my family was really bummed out about. But then he started going through his own personal transformation, therapy, and so forth. So he's being interviewed by Michael Nagler, who's the founder of Meta Nonviolence during the Summer of Peace, and Stephanie Van Hook. And at one point he said, it's all about coming back to the breath. He said, the way I become present is I come back to the breath. Well, a few days later, we had Cynthia Bourgeault, who's this brilliant Christian mystic, leading people in a meditation, bringing back to the breath. So you can see how all of this is integrating. We had Dot Maver interviewed with education. We had all these wonderful, wonderful people interviewed. So again, it's probably the best kept secret of goldmine wealth right now is the Summer of Peace archive. So please go and listen. Mary Lou Henner, who was the star of Taxi, was just a delight to interview. Just incredible joy and passion and creativity. Talk about the impact of media and then also health. We had also a declaration of commitment to indigenous people that James O'D wrote. And he presented to the indigenous grandmothers, calling for an apology, taking responsibility, reconciliation, and collaboration, that there's the need for this ancient indigenous wisdom to be integrated today. There was so much that just happened throughout the Summer of Peace. I mean, it was just, it was just like such a joy. And then we also were asked to speak at the United Nations on the first high-level forum for a culture of peace. So this wave, again, is rising. And what was beautiful is inspire, inform, and then invite each person to look for his or her own unique expression of what wants to flow through. And that can look differently. For some people, it's going to be meditating. For some people, it's going to be working in a homeless shelter. For others, it will be other ways. Now, there was another theme that came out during the Summer of Peace. And this theme was about the heartbreak and about the sacred process of having the heart shattered and then going through that process. Azim Khamisa, who I know has spoken here a couple of times, his story of moving to the United States to raise his family, a son and daughter, and losing his only son to senseless gang violence, going through 40 days of intense grieving, and his spiritual teacher, he had his own meditation practice, spiritual teacher saying, you have to start living for peace in your son's name. Azim's now a world figure on forgiveness. Kimmy Weeks, I've mentioned this story. Kimmy Weeks is one of my favorite heroes from Liberia. 9 years old in a refugee camp with his mother, and he's so sick, people think he's dead. His mother's not around, so they throw his body on a mass grave. And when his mother comes and finds him, she's sobbing, and he looks in her eyes and says, God, I dedicate my life to you to help children avoid this. And then Kimmy Weeks, it's just, he's got so much joy, and now he created the radio program that Search for Common Ground did. It's been replicated in 20 countries, reaching millions of people. We're helping young boys and girls. Another person you want to keep your eye on is Adam Bucko. Adam Bucko is coming out with a book with Matthew Fox's next year on occupying spirituality. Adam grew up in the Soviet Poland, where there was just a lot of oppression and a lot of suicide from young kids out of grief. And then he just had this intuition of starting to build an altar and to pray and do Mass on a regular basis. He goes to India. He's been mentored now by Andrew Harvey, Matthew Fox. He goes to India, sees homelessness. He's now started a foundation in New York that's working with homeless people, young homeless youth in New York. And he brings in the mystical aspect. So there's a lot of people who've gone through this sacred journey. This breaking of the heart, we also saw with Sandy Hook. what happened, the shooting. James O'D did a call immediately after that. He said there was a person from Newtown, Connecticut, and he said the town is different. People are broken wide open, and you can see a quality of difference in the connection between people. There's much more caring and openness. So when the crises do happen, there's the potential of cracking a person open, allowing us to see our vulnerability and our connection with the other. You know, apparently after 9/11, there were several days where people were walking around on the streets where you could see this. So the challenge is to allow the heart to go through that heartbreak. And in my book, I talk about this a lot. I mean, I've told a little bit about my heartbreak. And again, it's a fine line. It's one that I struggle with all the time. It's like going into the heartbreak and into despair, and then trying to stay into the place where I'm tuning in and offering my love to the divine. It's like, I don't know why you've created this, and I'm still going to love you. You know, it's such a dance to be able to do that. And then to awaken and listen. What Mickey Singer would say is listening to, following the energy. What is it that I need to do next? Which way do I need to go? And that's the dance we're all on. And it's happening on the secular level. It's happening across the society. So spirituality in action. There is this heart and soul of humanity arising. Velcro Ripper's 3 films, I highly encourage watching these. And I actually want to get them and watch them and have a house party. Scared Sacred, you know, he went to 9/11, Afghanistan, and he's interviewed people how when people go through these tragedies, they're scared into a sacred place. It's kind of like that saying, there's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole. I think that was Kurt Vonnegut, or Hemingway, anyway, somebody. And then his next film, Fierce Light, was looking at, boom, in response to these situations, there is a light that will come through humanity that is just fierce, and it will take on to transform the difficult situations. Fierce light. And believe me, the peace builders I've met across Africa, they're fierce, and there's also, it's interesting, that sense of joy that can come in. And also comedy. And we're seeing this in the Middle East right now. I just saw that a big transformation is happening in the Middle East. Is a lot of comedy is being used. It's like you can't really fight them, so just laugh at everybody. You know, it's just like so it's interesting because peace building is not always heavy and dense in this. I mean, it can be. I mean, believe me, there's situations none of us want to see. And at the same time, and this is that dance that I struggle with all the time too, it's like becoming so serious that I lose touch of the joy. And it's like how that dance. The new film that just came out is Occupy Love. And the way Velcro Ripper is spreading this around the world, he's inviting people to hold house parties to show Occupy Love. And I want to show you the trailer of Occupy Love. But before doing that, he said in this process of going around the world, he saw that people, when these terrible things happen, were looking for a sense of meaning. And then from that, to be able to take action to prevent it from happening to other people. This is in the DNA of the soul of humanity. This is what will carry us through the next 12 years. He says, and that action is rooted in love and compassion, a sense of interconnectedness, realizing that when we're destroying the environment, we're destroying ourselves, that there's unity in diversity, and that sameness is not equal to oneness. Velcro Ripper, I would encourage you to invite him in the future because he is a profound soul. And let's show this trailer from his film, Occupy Love.
There are moments in history where great civilizations are tasked with reinventing themselves or risking collapse.
We down emotionally, we down financially. It's killing me to look at my kids and know that they might not have nothing for real.
This same mentality that trashes people, trashes the planet.
What's wrong with us as a species?
Many people are losing hope, and they know how bad the situation is. How can the crisis be transformed into perhaps the greatest love story on Earth?
Good morning, Occupy Wall Street! Good morning, Occupy Wall Street! Good morning, planet Earth!
This movement against the Keystone XL pipeline, the Occupy movement, Arab Spring, these are all signalers of the emergence of the world's biggest and most profound social movement.
out of that love and that connection of people to each other, they're going to create a different way to do things.
An economist says that essentially more for you is less for me. But the lover knows that more for you is more for me too.
We live in a time of record-breaking crisis, but it's also a time of record-breaking vision.
Being awake is love. That's what it is. I see that the planet is going to be evolved by a massive uprising of creativity joy.
What if we were able to connect ourselves on a global basis? I think that humans are capable of great things. They're capable of love.
There is no love quite like that. The willingness to put it all on the line for your neighbors, for future generations, for the rest of creation.
The spark of a global spring is now blazing. We are creating a new paradigm as ancient as life.
How could this crisis be framed as a great love story?
It's pretty powerful, huh? We're all part of this big, big love story, and it's dancing through us. All we got to do is open our hearts, tune in, and let Shakti guide us in any way that she wants to. Yeah. And what's beautiful, this arising that's happening is merging with all these technologies in peace and conflict resolution and mediation. You can see people in Arab Spring trying to bring nonviolence. Sometimes they fail, sometimes they do it. And so we can see this merging together of these new technologies, together with the crises, together with the technologies, together with the love. And so out of that field, it's going to be emerging a world that we can't even imagine right now. We just have to do our own work and our collective work. So with that, again, thank you.